Hello and welcome to this story time. The story I'm about to tell you blends psychological realism with elements of psychological horror, making use of an unreliable narrator. However, it is important to distinguish between fiction and reality. Schizophrenia is a complex mental health condition that affects perception, cognition, and emotional regulation. Contrary to common misconceptions, people with schizophrenia are not inherently violent or dangerous. In fact, they are more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. This story takes creative liberties for the sake of suspense and should not be seen as a reflection of the lived experiences of all individuals with schizophrenia. If you or someone you know is experiencing symptoms of schizophrenia or other mental health challenges, professional help is available. Resources such as therapy, medication, and support groups can make a significant difference. All contact information regarding Sweden will be in the comment section or in the description. So, there's a bit of a content warning here. This story contains themes of mental illness, hallucinations, paranoia, and implied violence. Reader discretion is advised. The story's title is The Mirror in His Mind. Dr. Elias Norén had spent his career unraveling the mysteries of human behavior. As a behavioral scientist and lecturer, he prided himself on his ability to recognize patterns, to diagnose cognitive distortions, and help others understand their own mind. But he had never expected to become his own case study. It started subtly. Misplaced objects, faint whispers when no one was around, the feeling of being watched. A rational man, Elias, attributed these experiences to exhaustion. Academia demanded long hours and the overworked mind could play tricks. Then came the voice. Elias, you know this isn't real. He froze, pen hovering over his notes. The voice wasn't his own inner monologue. It was deeper, unfamiliar. He turned, expecting to see a colleague in his office, but he was alone. Over the next few weeks, the voice grew bolder. It commented on his lectures, his students, his thoughts before he had even fully formed them. And then the figure appeared, a shadow at the edges of his vision, standing in corners, reflected in glass. One evening, Elias sat at his desk, exhaustion pressing against his skull. He glanced at the window, at the city lights beyond. And then, in the reflection, the figure stepped forward. You see me now, the voice said. Elias turned sharply. Nothing. But when he looked back, the figure remained in the glass. He spent the night reading Schizophrenia. He checked the systems against his experiences. Hallucinations? Yes. Delusions? Possibly. Paranoia? Increasingly. Denial clawed at him. he confided in a colleague, Dr. Linde, who listened with careful neutrality. "You know what this sounds like, Elias," she said gently. He did. The diagnosis was inescapable. Medication dulled the hallucinations, but the figure, Johannes as he called himself, never truly disappeared. Therapy helped Elias manage the fractures in his reality. He continued teaching, now with a deeper empathy for those struggling with disorders he had once studied from a clinical distance. But then, murders began. A young woman, one of his students, found dead in an alley near campus. No forced entry, no witnesses. The police asked questions. Elias felt a deep unease, though he dismissed it. He had nothing to do with it. Then a second victim, a professor he had debated in faculty meetings. Elias barely slept. When he did, he dreamt of blood, of struggling bodies, of a shadowy figure standing over them, blade in hand. One night, he woke abruptly. His hands were sore. A metallic scent lingered in his apartment. He turned on the light, his shoes muddy, his nails darkened at the edges. And then he saw it. The message scrawled in his own handwriting on the mirror. "Do you see me now?" His breath came in short gasps. He backed away, shaking his head. "No, no, no, no." In the reflection, Johannes smiled. "You always knew." Elias clutched the edge of the sink, his mind splitting apart at the seams. His research had been meticulous, his understanding of schizophrenia unparalleled. He had accepted his condition, learned to live with it, but one thing he had never considered. What if Johannes wasn't just a hallucination? What if he was something more? And what if, in the darkest corners of Elias' mind, he had let him in? The mirror in his mind. Dr. Elias Norén had spent his career studying intricacies of human behavior. As a behavioral scientist and lecturer, he prided himself on his ability to recognize patterns, to diagnose cognitive distortions, and help others understand their own minds. But he had never considered that his greatest case study would be himself. It started subtly. Small things he brushed off as stress. A misplaced book, voices in the hallway when no one was there, the feeling of being watched. He had always been introspective and analyzing his thoughts with an almost obsessive rigor. So when the voice first spoke directly to him, he wasn't frightened, not at first. "Elias, you know this isn't real." He froze in his office, pen hovering over his notes. The voice wasn't his own internal monologue. It was deeper, unfamiliar. He turned around. The room was empty. Over the next few weeks, the voice returned sporadically. It didn't berate him or tell him to do anything dangerous. It simply commented on his lectures, on his research, on his personal life. Sometimes it even laughed at his jokes before he had finished thinking them. At first, Elias rationalized it was as stress-induced auditory hallucinations, a common symptom of sleep deprivation. But then came the figure, a man, just at the edge of his vision, always standing in a corner or reflected in glass. He never moved, he just watched. One evening, after a particular exhausting lecture, Elias sat at his desk, staring at his own reflection in the window. The city lights blurred behind his tired face, and then, in the reflection, the figure stepped forward. "You see me now," the voice said. Panic set in. Elias spent the night researching schizophrenia, the very disorder he had lectured about so many times. He had read the diagnostic criteria, checking off the symptoms. Hallucinations? Yes. Delusions? Possibly. Hadn't he been feeling as though his students were whispering about him? Disorganized thinking? His notes had been harder to follow lately. Denial clawed at him. He needed a second opinion. He confided in a colleague, Dr. Lind, who listened with careful neutrality. "You know what this sounds like, Elias?" she said gently. He did. He had always known, but knowing wasn't the same as accepting. Over the following months, he documented his experiences like a researcher studying a subject. He learned the figure had a name, Johannes. The voice claimed to be a part of him, not a separate entity. Medication dulled Johannes, but didn't erase him. Therapy helped Elias navigate his fragmented reality. He continued teaching, now with a deeper empathy for those struggling with disorders he had once only studied in theory. One evening, as he walked home, he caught his reflection in a shop window. Johannes stood beside him. "You don't hate me anymore?" the voice said. Elias took a deep breath. "No," he admitted. "I think I'm learning to live with you." And for the first time, Johannes smiled. Okay, this was 2 different stories. Usually we hear the first story more often in movies and in stories. The darker version. Why do you think that is? This last story had a happy ending. He learned to live with his schizophrenia, and no one was injured. Should we have more stories like this? Yeah. I hope you liked the story. Take care.